Welcome everyone to Babble. I'm Megan Thomas, and today I'll be chatting to poet Christina Thatcher. Christina's work extends from her two collections into the Welsh poetry scene, local community workshops, creative writing lecturing, as well as being poetry editor for the Cardiff Review. I'm very excited to talk about all the different forks in Christina's career. Hi Christina, how are you?
I'm great, Meg. So good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, so how is everything going with you? You are just starting lectures again in the new lockdown version of lectures. What's that been like?
Yeah, that has been really interesting. So actually in Cardiff, we are in lockdown again, a firebreaker circuit lockdown. So a lot of my lecturing experience this term has been lecturing online and then having these really lovely kind of socially distanced meetups outside on campus where we can go for a walk. Cardiff Met has an amazing ancient forest with lots of storytelling circles. So we can go for a walk and have cups of coffee and tea. So it's very different as a term than before, but I have been discovering lots of new creative and innovative ways to teach and ways to use our online teaching and the intimacies of our homes to kind of elicit new types of inspiration that maybe we wouldn't get in a normal classroom. So although it has been tiring and challenging at times, it also has been a really creative journey in itself. So that's been kind of a joy of lockdown in a way.
Yeah, it is quite wonderful seeing how adaptable everyone actually is when put to it. Do you have some examples of some of the different types of online teaching you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm running now, so normally we would have classes across the whole 12 weeks of term, but instead we are doing these block classes. So I'm teaching my classes in 4-week blocks so that my students have this sort of space and mental and emotional energy to engage with a topic really in depth. And that has been very interesting. So instead of having, 1 or 2 hour seminars every week, we have a huge 4-hour seminar and each hour is dedicated to something different. So say they're working on a group project or they're doing a workshop or I'm teaching them something about craft or about professional practice. And that's something that we wouldn't have normally done in regular teaching. And also students are having an opportunity to do lots of different kinds of self-directed activities. So I might ask students to listen to a podcast and reflect and have a conversation together. And I can just kind of zoom into their conversation. So I can just kind of join these conversations that are happening in all different parts of Wales or the UK online. And that's something that's really, really lovely. So I guess the ways that we're teaching are different in terms of the length that we're teaching, in terms of how we actually divide our attention and dedicate ourselves to creativity. Instead of these short, sharp bursts, our students are getting much longer times to write, to read, and to think about topics more in depth. And I think that that's such a luxury and such a nice escape from the pandemic and the difficulties that we're facing now.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like they're the kind of things that actually will probably carry on into the, dare I say it, new normal, because people being in their own space when they're writing is so critical to their thinking process, kind of being in a sterile lecture theatre, not to suggest that Cardiff Met isn't a lovely place. All lecture theatres feel a little bit unhomely, the word I'd use. So yeah, that must really kind of bring out some creative juices in the students.
It's true. And I think it's also really interesting. Like I'm even taking a course myself now at the poetry school, and the idea of being able to just turn off my camera and write in my own room and then suddenly turn it back on and be in a group. That's sort of amazing. Like that there's something kind of really lovely about that. So you know that you're part of a group, you know that people are writing in different places, but you also have this sort of sanctity and quiet of your home. And not everyone's homes are kind of sanctuaries or quiet places, but I think that there's a level of comfort and a level of quiet that comes with knowing the space that you're in, but knowing that as well, as soon as you click that camera button, you're suddenly in the room again with everyone else. And I think that that probably sparks a different level or a different type of creativity than maybe we would have gotten if we were all together in a lecture theatre, as you say. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, that does sound interesting. And so the one thing that brought you to Wales, if I'm right in thinking, is your master's degree in creative writing. But do you want to tell me a little bit more about that decision to move from America to Wales, across the pond, if you will?
Yes, of course. So I don't know. I think when we're young, maybe this is just me, but I have heard other people talk about this too. We kind of build up these images of places in our minds, and we kind of make them into a fantasy place. And I remember being a child, and my grandmother telling me that my last name, which is Thatcher, is a very popular name in the UK. Maybe not so much in Wales, but certainly in England. And so I think from that young age, I was like, oh, maybe that's where I belong. Maybe I belong over there. And then I started reading loads and loads of English literature. I majored in English literature in university. And I just kind of had this fascination with the UK. And I came to study abroad in 2007 in London, where I took an advanced Shakespeare course and did lots of things which were stereotypically English or British. And although I really loved that experience, and I really loved visiting Cambridge and Oxford and Bath and all these really beautiful cities, um, I felt that maybe I actually didn't belong in those places as a working class person from America. And the more that I learned about Wales, because I love the weather, strangely, in the UK. I love so many of the people here and the landscapes and everything. I just wanted to find a place where I felt more at home. And Wales seemed to be that place for me. So when I started to apply for master's degrees, Cardiff University was actually the place which had the exact kind of course that I wanted. And it gave me an opportunity to come to this place where I felt like actually I get the best of both worlds. I get to come here and be in the UK, which is a place I've dreamed about since I was young. But I also get to be in a part of it where I feel more at home as maybe a working class person and as a person connected to vast and beautiful landscapes. So it was really nice to be able to come for my master's in Wales. And I actually fell in love with it in a way. I mean, I fell hard. I just couldn't imagine living anywhere else. It's a wonderful place to live. And my master's was fabulous. I mean, it was a master's which combined creative process and also teaching creative writing. And, you know, that's actually how we met, because you took the same master's degree. So I'm really hoping that you found that same kind of affinity with that degree and also with Wales as an adopted home for you. So I have been here now for 10 years, and I can't imagine making any other place my home.
Oh. Christina, a huge journey milestone that you've completed this year is your PhD. And I've realized you've spent years doing this. So me asking you to summarize it into a soundbite is probably very difficult. But can you tell me and the audience a little bit about what your PhD was about?
Yeah, of course. It has been a long time, actually, 6.5 years working on that PhD part-time, but I would do it again in a heartbeat. So my PhD was split into two components, a creative component and a critical component. The creative was actually my first collection, More Than You Were. So it was a poetry collection written about my dad's death. He died of a drug overdose in 2013, and it was really overwhelming and challenging to deal with. So writing poetry helped me kind of manage that and come to terms with his death. And afterwards, I thought, because poetry had been such a help to me, that I might try and discover if it could help other people. So the critical components of my PhD looked at whether creative writing could positively impact people who had experienced a bereavement by addiction. Losing somebody to a drug addiction is really challenging because it comes with lots of conflicting emotions of shame and guilt, and also you face stigma and disenfranchised grief. So I thought writing might be a good therapeutic intervention for that population. And in many ways, it turned out that that was the case. So now I'm working on publishing some journal articles and creating some materials for grief counselors and drug addiction support counselors so that they might be able to use writing to support this population.
Yeah, and that all ties into all the workshops that you do, and you do quite a few. I don't know if you want to outline a couple of them.
Yeah, I mean, I started probably the main thing. I started with these deaf writing workshops. So I did a deaf writing series in Cardiff for a number of years. And I started those because when I lost my dad, writing was really helping me and reading lots of poems was really helping me. But even still, I felt really alone. Grief is a really challenging thing to deal with on your own. And if you lose someone to something like a drug addiction, people often don't understand the feelings that you're kind of experiencing or going through. And often people might think that, well, you didn't have a very close relationship with that person, or that person caused you a lot of trouble. Maybe you should just get over it. So there's all these kind of feelings that come up as a result of that. So I started the death writing workshops to give a sort of safe place where people could come and read poetry about death, write their own work, and where we could talk about things which are normally taboo and which aren't usually discussed. And that was a really uplifting, strangely uplifting experience to run those workshops. And people came who had lost someone really recently. I remember some people coming who had lost friends to suicide within 2 weeks or 3 weeks and had nowhere to go. And then people who'd lost their parents 30 years before, because grief isn't something that we normally get to discuss in everyday life. So it really gave a space for people to do that. And it really helped me feel like there was a community of other people who knew what I might have been going through at the time. So that was really wonderful. I also run lots of other projects, lots of other workshops and kind of projects across Wales and the UK for art galleries and youth and community centres, for mental health groups, and all kinds of other things. And I run the biggest writers group in Wales called Roath Writers. And that's a community group for people who have all different various level of writing experience. And that's really been the backbone of my time here in Wales. I started it 8 years ago, and hundreds and hundreds of people have come. And it's a donation-only group, so anyone can join. And some people just come because they have nothing to do on a Tuesday, and other people have published many books and have PhDs in writing. And it's really amazing to see how writing can bring together a whole host and whole different kind of community of people in these spaces, now on Zoom, but normally housed in this beautiful art center called The Gate. So yeah, I have found that leading writing workshops has been a terrific form of community building. I believe that writing and reading are a form, or give us the opportunity to enact social change and can be personally transformative. So having the opportunity to run all these different kinds of workshops and projects has been just one of the highlights of my life here in Wales.
Yes, and just the fact that so many people from so many different backgrounds do come just shows that writing is not an elitist, artsy thing to do, kind of if you can afford to, but rather something that a lot of people feel a great need to do and can get some kind of control of their lives back through.
Oh, definitely.
Was there a point in your life where you were actively using writing as a coping mechanism, or is it just something that's always been why you write?
So I think when I look back, I think I started writing as a young child to escape my sort of home circumstances. So I grew up in a home which was characterized by drug use and domestic violence and poverty. And writing was really a way for me to manage that, either by reflecting and kind of exploring those feelings, or by escaping and writing stories about fantastical lands or about my move to the UK one day. So I think writing really gave me the opportunity as a young person to do that. And then as I got older, I started to write both as a way to manage my feelings, like I did in the early days of writing More Than You Were, but also as a way to produce art and to join an artistic conversation. So I love reading and read a huge amount of poetry. And I feel like when I publish poetry professionally, I'm able to join wider conversations about the human experience that I think is a really important thing to be able to do. So for me, it's not just writing about my internal feelings, thoughts, and frame of mind as a way to kind of manage and understand and ask questions about those things, but it's also about what it means to work a poem to the point of publication. I think that editing is really powerful tool for all poets. So for me, actually editing my poems with the view of publishing them has been incredibly powerful, because it really gives me a chance to think about these ideas or narratives that I'm writing down and really choose the precise verb or the precise noun that I want. So that in that way, I'm kind of taking control of or asserting a view of these maybe experiences that have happened to me, or things in my life that I want to explore more deeply. And so that kind of process of writing out the reflective part is often therapeutic, but so is this sort of editing side, trying to get poems ready for publication, knowing that they are going to be representing in some way an experience or idea or emotion that I've had. And that when that goes out into the world, I'll be joining these wider conversations. So I think my relationship with writing has evolved, but I suppose in all of the writing that I do, it is about discovery and understanding and question seeking and figuring out what it means to live in this world.
That was brilliantly answered. That's, I think, what a lot of people gain from reading poetry as well. And certainly your poems reflect that. You've written about this extraordinary tough time in your life in both your anthologies, but I actually read them the wrong way round. So I read How to Carry Fire first, and then More Than You Were. And it was a really interesting way to do it, because you've got to this point when you're writing How to Carry Fire where you're carrying the fire. Whereas with More Than You Were, it was kind of like seeing the fleshy underneath of something that I'd already seen the surface of. So it was a very interesting way to do it. And what really struck me was, I think, lesson 2 in More Than You Were. The poem is kind of, to paraphrase it, which is an absolute bastardization for poetry, to try and paraphrase a poem. But you say, your father always said never to touch fire because it gives you blisters. And the fact that then your next collection is called How to Carry Fire really shows that that realization that you're more than he was, that what you're trying to do with that first anthology. And so, not that I'd recommend everyone go read them backwards, but you'll see when you read both of them the journey that Christina's gone through the poetry. If I understand correctly, How to Carry Fire was originally called How to Build a Boat. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah, that was
what inspired the change.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So when I first started writing How to Carry Fire, I mean, and you rightly said, my first book, I feel like these are sort of in a way poetic memoirs. So my first book is stemming from my dad's, death and all the experiences of that. And then the second book kind of carries on both some experiences in my childhood and growing up in America, but then comes to Wales. So there is a definite progression. And when I started writing How to Carry Fire, I really started actually writing about that progressive move. So what it actually meant to cross the ocean, and what it meant to have a new life, and what that barrier of water meant in terms of like my objectivity and my distance from this place where I grew up. So really the poems that I started writing for this second question had a lot to do with water and the ocean. But in the middle of writing How to Carry Fire, my brother, who I love very much, who also struggles with drug addiction, he relapsed. And it was devastating because after my father died, he got clean for a few years and his life was going really well. So when he relapsed, that was really hard. And so I started writing about that. And his name is Tim. Tim and I had lots of conversations. And it was really interesting because as he was kind of spiraling downward into his relapse, a lot of our conversations kept coming back to this fire, the fire that started the kind of catalyst for him. He had been using drugs before, but our dad burnt down our family home, which is where this book starts, How to Carry Fire Now. And I sort of suddenly realized that so much of the transformation that has happened in my life, and in my brother's life and my mom's life and my dad's life happened from this fire. Like this was quite literally the ignition point and the things that kind of sent us all off in our directions. So for me, it sent me over here to the UK. For my brother, it unfortunately spiraled into his drug addiction. For my dad, it did the same and it led to his death. And for my mom, it led to her freedom and her divorce from my dad and her ability to start her own business and to flourish and grow. So it kind of ignited all these different transformative paths for us. So I started writing into that fire. I took an amazing workshop at the English Art Teachers Conference where the first poem of this collection had its first kind of draft. And it was a workshop on the poetry of witness and what it means to witness tragedy. And it was talking about the Glenville Towers and the fire there. So I started to write into my own fire experience and what it was like to lose that house. And then suddenly the collection pivoted, and it was this language of fire and this opportunity to write about the many metaphorical and literal ways that fire has changed my life that brought you the collection that is now published. So I would say that was about 2 years into writing this that it kind of turned and suddenly became clear.
Yeah, well, and there is so much imagery that you discuss and around fire, the kind of things that can grow from fire, the things that it destroys, the relationship people have with it, the fear they have of it, the warmth they gain from it. There's so many ways of looking at it. You wrote How to Carry Fire as a collection versus how More Than You Were was part of your PhD. Did you feel like you had more freedom when you were writing How to Carry Fire, or was it almost more, there was too much direction, it was a bit harder to hone it in?
I did feel like I had more freedom, and actually that freedom was kind of terrifying because although, earlier you talked about More Than You Were, feeling like the fleshy underside, I think that's really interesting and apt way to discuss it. But with More Than You Were, because grief is so unwieldy and difficult and chaotic, I set very rigid rules for myself to actually write More Than You Were. So these poems, I set them so that they had to be very short. They had to be like less than 25 lines. Most of them are in one stanza, so they have a lot of white space around them to kind of represent the unsaid things. They also, I use pronouns in a particular way. It was also put through a book analyzer so that it had language which was accessible and mostly monosyllabic, so that people who were functionally illiterate could also read the story. So there was a lot of very, very specific rules that dictated the way that I could write about grief in my first book. But with How to Carry Fire, those rules didn't exist anymore. So I was writing into this like unknown space, and I knew that I wanted to write about the ocean initially and about this kind of transformative journey from America to Wales. And then I knew after these conversations with my brother that I wanted to write into fire, but the ways in which I did that weren't dictated, or I didn't self-impose any rules. And so that felt really frightening. And it felt very different. I think you can see that these collections are written by the same author, but like this feels like a big progression for my writing because these poems were longer, they were more complex, they used different kinds of imagery, different kinds of metaphor, I used white space differently. All the tools that I kind of employed in my first collection were used differently in this collection. And I feel like that is really positive. And I remember going to this workshop with Caroline Bird earlier in this year before COVID locked us all down. And she said that if you are writing a poem and you're not discovering something new, like the poem is already dead. Writing a poem is an act of discovery in itself. And I felt like every poem I wrote in this book was an act of discovery because I didn't know where it was going or what it would look like or where I would end up. But kind of doing that in a very different way. So instead of setting structured rules where I knew this poem had to fit these rules, giving myself an opportunity to write into these themes and discover what would happen, I think was really valuable.
Yeah. And well, so that with poems, they're so personal and so filled with self-discovery that you do wonder how other people edit them. And so you're doing a lot of editing for your students. You also edit for the Cardiff Review. Do you find that you've got to get yourself in a really good zone that you can let the poem exist how it's supposed to while still giving critical feedback to it?
This is an interesting question. I really love editing, but what I do for my students and what I do for the Cardiff Review are really different. Because as an editor for the Cardiff Review, really what I'm doing is choosing. It's like picking my favorite desserts from the fridge. I'm getting hundreds of poems all the time to read and look at, and I really love it. But I'm not actually doing anything really critical. I'm sort of tapping in to the sort of tenets of good poetry, or what I perceive to be as good poetry, and poetry that moves me, and poetry that is well crafted and well organized and well structured. And I select those poems to be published with the magazine. What I'm doing with my students is something very different because what I'm looking at is the ways in which their poems have potential. and where those poems might go. So I'm doing line edits and line suggestions. Is this verb really the best verb? Is this ending too close? How can we open it? What is the heart of this poem? I ask the students that all the time. What is the heart? Like, what are you trying to accomplish with this? And is this structure, or are these tools that you have used helping you accomplish that thing? So really the kind of editing that I'm doing with my students is about having a conversation. And it's really nice to meet those poems on the page and then figure out what potential these poems have, and then having those discussions with students so that their poems can speak as loudly and as clearly as possible. So it's quite a different mindset than it is to say write generatively or do writing. And for me, editing is one of the great joys in life. I find it really engaging because it's an excuse every time I come to edit a poem or provide feedback for a poem. It's an excuse to think deeply about the world and about the language that poem is using. And gosh, that is so fun.
And so I know, of course, you do this for a living constantly. And so this question might be a trickier one, but do you have any kind of pearly nuggets of advice for people who want to write poetry that can't do the whole course with you?
I mean, it's very difficult not to give the standard advice, which is, the first thing that I would always say is that you should read, like absolutely read poems. Like, I think people are natural poets and natural storytellers. Like we're an oral species, and we like to eulogize things in poetry, and we like to celebrate things in poetry. And that's something that I think people have a sort of natural affinity toward. But if you want to write poetry, then I think reading it and understanding where you and your voice might fit within the contemporary conversation is really, really important. And I think reading can be incredibly inspiring. So I often tell people to do that. And I'm a big fan of the after poem for people who are not really sure where to start. Of course, they can free write their ideas and experiences onto the page, and they can just begin writing from a place of where their interests are. But if they're not really sure where to write, then if you do this reading and start reading quite a lot, then you can start easily with, say, like the Poetry Book Society list, or you can have a little look online on themes in bookstores. So if you want to read things about grief, you can type that in and see what poetry covers those themes. But if you find a poem that you really like, then you can borrow the first line or the last line or the middle line that speaks to you and start there. And if you decide to publish that poem, you can make it an after poem. And I love writing those. There are a couple of those in my book, How to Carry Fire, where I've borrowed a line or a structure or an idea from another poet, and I've put after them, after Ellen Bass or after William Brewer. And that way your poetry kind of spiders out and links to these other writers, recognizing them, paying homage or honoring them. And that makes me feel a part of this wider poetic community as well. So I always feel like reading is a great place to start so that you can see what is happening in the poetry world. And I would suggest trying to read widely from both like independent publishers and more mainstream publishers so that you can get a really good scope of what is being made.
Did you find that you were reading a lot of poetry before you moved to Wales, or was your move part of the process of being able to do that?
This is a great question. So I was an English literature major in university, and so I read a lot of poetry, but it was quite like traditional poetry. I would say the most contemporary poets I was reading were like the Romantics. So not a lot of
edgy
at all. But when I came to do my master's in Cardiff University, I started reading a lot of contemporary poets. And I had a bit of a rule for myself that I wasn't really going to read any poets who were published, after so they had to be basically published in the last 5 years. So I started to really get to know the British publishers, and I started to really get to know really hyper contemporary poetry. And that was that was life changing in terms of my understanding of what poetry was and the kinds of things that poetry could do. And I would really recommend that people start doing that because that really helped me kind of discover my own voice. I don't think that we can honestly begin to discover how our own contemporary voices might fit in to the contemporary poetry scene if you're only reading metaphysical poets. I think it's important to read those poets for many reasons, but I think kind of finding out what contemporary poets are doing today is so important. So I started to do that when I moved to the UK. And for that reason, I consider myself, although I'm American, I would consider myself more connected to the British contemporary poetry scene than to the American one. Although I read quite a lot of American poets and European poets and South American poets, I feel like a lot of my contemporary poetry education came from being in Britain, reading lots of books that were published here from independent publishers, and going to a lot of community poetry events and a lot of events around the country. And now those are more accessible than ever because you can attend those online. So that really, really helped me understand more about what was being published today and where my work might fit in. And if people aren't sure, I would also recommend, I know I'm like giving lots of recommendations here, but there's some amazing poetry podcasts, like the Lunar Poetry Podcast in Britain, and also the VS Poetry Foundation podcast in America, where you can actually hear poets read and talk about their own work. And that was also very helpful for me, actually getting to hear poets discussing poetry and talking about their challenges and their pitfalls and their successes and their fears. That was so valuable.
Yeah. Well, I've always thought when people say they hate poetry, it's usually because they were forced to read a sonnet when they were 16 and they didn't understand anything that they were reading and they couldn't hear what was being said, because a lot of poetry in the author's own voice is so much more powerful. And yeah, I think maybe if we just got kids listening and engaging with slightly more modern poetry, people wouldn't leave high school thinking they hate it.
And, I teach first year poetry at Cardiff Met, and that is something that I always notice. There is like a sort of, it's a little bit of the wrong way around, I think, in the way that poetry is taught for young people, because it's a sort of dissection first technique. It's like, let's go into this poem and find all these quote unquote hidden meanings and understand, like, can you, highlight the image, or can you highlight the metaphor? Can you, highlight these literary devices? And I think that those things, being able to understand what those devices do and be able to articulate them that's important. But for me, and the thing that I always get my year one students to do, is to first meet the poem at a place of emotion, or intellectual curiosity. Like, do you like this poem? Do you actually enjoy this poem? Does it move you emotionally, or does it make you think about something, or does it challenge you intellectually? Like, how do you feel about this poem? And that is where we start, because that is how poems, from my perspective, are meant to be read. They're meant to be read as like through the kind of prism of our emotions and our intellect. And we need to begin there before we start kind of taking the life out of it and doing the dissection point. Because if you start from a place of, do you like this poem? And you get a yes, then you can explore, like, well, why? Like, what is moving you? And then we can talk about the technicalities, the things that the poet are doing that are most interesting to us. And if we get a no, then we can actually figure out, well, what is this poet doing that is disrupting your enjoyment? Like, how can we figure that out? And either way, we get to talk about those literary devices. But if we go in from a place of enjoyment and just general understanding, that it can be such a useful way to get people to actually engage and reflect on how poetry impacts them.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's the only art form that does this the wrong way around. No one listens to a song and the first thing they think is, well, what key is this in? It's a kind of, this makes me feel joy. This makes me feel good, but sad. And then you kind of figure out, or watching a film, which camera angle are they using over there? It's just not done. But
and what's really interesting about that is I did a collaboration with How to Carry Fire with a musician this year. And very sadly, my in-person launch was canceled. It was definitely the right thing to do because of COVID and the risk. But for that launch, I worked with a musician friend named Stephen Kenward, and he wrote 3 songs based on this book. One of them was based on a center that I used my brother's words for. Another was based on one of the poems toward the end. And the first song that he wrote was about fire. So it was going to kind of open the event. And when we were having that conversation, I realized I didn't have the language because the way that I was always taught about music, although I played the flute for many years and I also played the guitar. So I had like language, to kind of talk about the chords and things like that and progression, but not very much language. And so a lot of our collaboration was him trying things out and sending them to me and said, does this sound like fire to you? Yes or no? Like, does it move you in this way? And that was such a powerful way to have that collaboration and understanding. And then I could ask him for the technical parts because I was quite interested. Like, oh, I really like this thing that went up and down, but I don't even know what instrument that is. And he was like, oh, it's this ancient instrument. And here's how I'm using it. It was absolutely amazing. So not only did I learn so much about music and the language of music, but I was being able to be led by my emotions and my experience of the music was so valuable and encouraged me to want to learn more about it. And I think definitely that's something that I think would be useful for young people who are being taught poetry. And I'm sure there are plenty of teachers who do that. But on the whole, I definitely get a lot of students saying that they really don't like poetry when they start coming into university. And I view it as part of my responsibility to hopefully turn that around for them.
Yeah. And they say they don't like poetry, and then they read a poem that they like. It's like, oh, except that one. You've got to figure out why that is. So now it seems like the perfect point for me to ask if you'd mind reading one of your poems for us.
Yeah, of course. I would be happy to. I never know exactly what poems to read. I have some favorites, and I also have some poems that I rarely read. But I think today, when we're talking about fire and the language of fire and the ways in which I discussed fire, there's one poem in the collection that really covers, both the literal and metaphorical understanding of fire, which is what this collection aims to do. So this collection was kind of born out of some research. It's called Arson, and it considers the statutes when it comes to arson in Pennsylvania. So what counts as arson? But it also that looks at some of the things that I thought about when it came to fire in a more metaphorical way. So I feel like this is a good poem to read that kind of captures both parts of the collection. So here we go. Arson. To be considered arson, a fire must be set with intent to endanger. If a building is occupied and the fire kills people inside, this is first degree. If a building is unoccupied but destroyed, this is second degree. If a fire causes danger, undefined, but no one dies, and the building doesn't burn completely, this is third degree. But the statutes are unclear about what happens when you live in an arsonist family, and every home you occupy burns to the ground again and again. And every night you must get quicker at rebuilding, at practicing shallow breathing when the smoke enters your room. And you must learn the art of prevention, to collect wet wood, braid bedsheet ropes for window escapes, pour cat litter into gasoline tanks. The statutes are unclear about what happens when you inherit arson, when you cut your arm and bleed fire, fire. Thank you.
That was incredible. I've got goosebumps. I don't know if you can see this. That was so great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Christina, for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for either watching or listening to Babble. It's been great to have you here. And I'm sure you were as fascinated by everything Christina had to say as I was. You can follow her on Twitter and Instagram, Right to Empower. Am I right? That's the links? Yep. And she is there and sharing poetry recommendations and nuggets on her own life, and I would recommend going to do that, as well as buying her most recent or her previous book, most recent being How to Carry Fire. Thanks everyone. Chat to you next time. Bye.